the services they offer, which provides helps with API security based on the tool that you can use. So let's just go quick into it. Let's just go right into it. Okay, so the first slide I have here is introduction. What is API basically? You've heard the terms API, API, API. What is API? I try as much as possible to use simple definitions so that you really understand what API is, what it does, and if you have any questions, you can always leave those questions on the group chat. We'll respond to those questions after the slides, and also the slide will also be shared at the end of this training to participants. So what is API? API is an acronym for the word application programming interface. Really, my own explanation, there are a lot of explanations that you have out there, but if I want to make it very simple for you to understand, I'd say it's an interface that allows two applications or two programs to communicate with each other or to talk to each other. In other words, it's not just one or two applications, it can even be more. It allows them to, it's like a microservice or a middleware that allow them to communicate and talk together and also share, data and resources with each other. So API is really rapidly used these days. It's very difficult for people to build a product or to build an application these days without some sort of API being embedded into this product, right? So API are incredibly important in modern day software development, where application needs to be able to communicate with each other, share data. What does this do? It enables the application to be able to scale, right? It brings about scalability, it brings about flexibility, it brings about security, and it also helps with innovation. So API does quite a lot in modern day software development while developing products. So if you are building a product without APIs, I think it happens previously, right? But those kind of applications are very difficult to scale in the sense that if you want to add some more layers, some more modules into the application, it now becomes a problem. You definitely run into situations where you have to tear down the whole application to really build again. And it doesn't just help that whole agile framework while building product very flexible. So yeah, that's like an introduction to API itself. So why API security? First of all, what is API security? Like it's basically the practice of protecting APIs from unauthorized access, data breach, and security risk. So because of how sensitive API is, when an API is embedded into a product or is used to build a product, it houses a lot of information. It holds a lot of data, right? Some might even be very sensitive data. So that is the essence, or that is why you need API security, right? So it is not just, it not only enables users to interact with the application, but it also facilitates communication between, underlying internal service, many of which transmit sensitive and store sensitive data. So you have a product, you have a product. Within that product, you have user access. Within that user access, you have top level authorizations and the like, where a user can be able to perform different tasks or carry out different functionalities. These are reasons why you need API securities in place. An insecure API can provide a lot of risk. Entry point attack, database spoofing, different kind of things. It gives attacker, like a very happy, happy mood to be able to bamboozle and mess around with your product. right? These are why, and at the long run or at the end product of this kind of thing, you end up having heavy loss in resources. It could lead to billions of dollars in losses. We've had scenarios where companies are being hacked and they lose a lot of money. It happens even in the crypto space. Now that we have Web3, we are seeing a lot of these things happening. Even with AI introduction into the playbook, a lot of these things happen. So that is actually why you need API security. I'll try and be as quick as possible so I can give other speakers the required time for them to also walk you through on more sensitive data. So what are the common API security threats we have? So you get to see SQL injection. These are like injection attack where people get to inject bots, inject different things into your API just to mess around with your data. We have authentication and unauthorization vulnerability. So when your authentication and your authorization systems are not very rigid, you see a lot of attack coming through that regards. We have cross-site stripping. We have data exposure. We also have denial of service attack. So denial of service attack, what does that really mean? I'll try as much as possible to explain one or two API security threats that you have out there. So denial of service attack, the attacker floods the API with high volume of requests. So you get to build some APIs, you see that, oh, you want this API to be able to time out at so time. It should be able to handle this or that request, not a maximum of maybe 1,000 requests at a particular call interval. So in this kind of attack, the attacker, right, he floods the API with high volume of requests in order to make it unavailable for legitimate user. When he makes it unavailable for legitimate, he now uses that time that it's not available for users to now perpetrate, this security breach and all that. This type of attack typically occur when team fail to implement quotes or throttlings. So what that means is that some of the security measures that you can put in place to curb this denial of service is to set parameters to how these APIs are being called. Take, for example, you put a time limit or a call limit to how many times people can actually call this API within the space of 1 minute. These are security measures one can put in place to curb common API security threats. So for injection attack, I just gave a very brief definition. I say malicious code or command injected into API codes. These are what people do. You understand? These are what people do. That's why you can never re-emphasize or stop talking about API security. It's very, very important in building products these days. So we have authentication and authorization issues, failure to properly authenticate and authorize users, or probably not allocating the right authorizations to users. So for example, the two words are actually different, authentication and authorization. So lack of proper token validation, allowing unauthorized user access into your APIs. These can also be a form of security threat on APIs. So we also have data exposure, right? Exposing sensitive data due to improper handling can also be a major problem. So you have instances where you have, I would say maybe like your API key exposed, or you are not passing it properly, or the way you pass it, you probably pass it on a request payload or a params and the likes. Those are not the proper ways to handle those kind of sensitive data. So one needs to take, adequate steps in order to secure your API, in order to secure it, to avoid common API security threats. So we also have data exposure, right? exposing sensitive data due to improper handling, inadequate data masking leading to leak of user information. So like I said, API have a lot of communications to do with within two different apps. And the same way it brings them together, it also moves information vice versa to one or two or three more apps. So the way you handle those data, the way you max those data that is being moved to perform a service across each of these apps is very, very important. Very important. So I'll talk about API authentication and authorization. So what is API authentication? I initially said that both of them are actually two different things. So API authentication verifies that a user is who they claim they are. So take, for example, you want to authenticate into a service, just like I have an e-commerce website. I am a super admin. I am also an e-commerce website will basically have like a super admin interface. It will have a vendor interface. It will have a shopper interface, maybe a retail customer interface, right? So authentication is a system that separates these different users. So if I am a customer and I log into the marketplace storefront and I'm seeing the dashboard where I can perform high level, authorizations, then that means my authentication was not done properly. So authentication system puts a user in the scope where they fall into. So take, for example, you are an admin. When you log in, you should be able to see an admin interface. I am a vendor. When I log in, I should be able to see a vendor's interface. A customer should also be able to see a customer interface, right? So that's what authentication system does. And there are different ways one can authenticate a service, a microservice, right? You can use base authentication. You can use OAuth authentication. You can use token authentication. You can use API key authentication. There's just a whole lot that you can do with API authentication system. So we have different tools that you can use to see the kind of authentications you can use. You also have digest authentication, JWT bearer token authentication. So a lot of authentication systems that one can use to authenticate a product or an application. So authorization, what is authorization? After you have proved that a user's identity, after you've proved the user's identity, you can now check which data that user is allowed to access, which is my very simple explanation using an e-commerce website. An admin should be able to see things related to him as an admin. A user should be able to see things related to him as a customer. A vendor should be able to see things related to him or her as a customer. That is authorization. So authorization ensures that the user is authorized to view or to edit a specific set of data, right? So yeah, that's just like a brief clarification to, authentication and authorization systems. So what are the best practice for API security? We heard about authentication and authorization systems. In simple terminology, use strong authentication mechanisms. So when you are building an API, one of the best practice is to use strong authorization and authentication systems. So if you are using OAuth, any of these authentication mechanisms you are using, OAuth, API key, bearer token, digest token, make sure they are strong authorization tokens, right? You get to see some applications where they have password generators, right? They have password generators in place. The normal standard is you should have uppercase, lowercase, hash characters, alphanumeric characters, and the like. That's what it actually means, right? Implement role-based access control to restrict unauthorized actions. Then you have input validation. Validate and sensitize users' input to prevent injection and attack. use input validation libraries and frameworks. So like I said, we have different kind of password generators. Those are what it actually means, right? You can get to use libraries, you can get to use framework just to help you your input validations, right? So we have data encryption. It is very, very important these days to encrypt data that is being displayed on the web. Everything that happens on the web now leaves a footprint, right? Anything you do leaves a footprint. But how do you minimize this footprint on the web? Is to use encryptions. Encrypt data in transit using protocols like HTTPS. We all know that when you go to one of the ways to assert a secure platform is to see that, oh, this platform has HTTPS as part of its domain URL, right? So implement protocols like HTTPS, use end-to-end encryption to sensitive data. So we also have implement rate limiting and throttling, which the end goal is to prevent denial of service, right? Limits, basically what that does is it limits, rate limits are code that restrict the number of requests a client can make on an API. So these are things you can put in place to enable or to implement security on an API, right? So the end goal of this is to prevent denial of service, people attacking the website by spoofing it with a lot of requests at a particular time so that it denies legitimate users access to that endpoint before it starts trying to hack the endpoint or cause damage on that microservices. Yeah, we also have monitor your APIs for suspicious activities. So I believe monitoring API for suspicious activities cut across using tools. So you have different tools that you can use to monitor how your API perform. You know, one of the tools were things that was just mentioned, that was mentioned before I started speaking. We have a lot of tools that you can use for it. Yeah. So you monitor the activities of your API. You see, it will help you to monitor downtimes. It will help you to monitor the rate at which this API performs. It will help you to monitor how people are consuming these APIs, you know, and a lot of things. So security monitoring involves continuous monitoring of API telemetric data to detect security threats and breach as soon as they occur. So once you have this in place, you can be able to see how your API performs, monitor how it performs, and be able to catch suspicious activity even before the perpetrator gets to cause havoc on the APIs. Yeah, so in summary, when developing APIs or API security strategy, it's important to use the right tools, right? It's important to use the right tool. That helps you avoid exploitable security vulnerability while providing full coverage throughout the API lifecycle. So yeah, that's it from me. I'll look at the chat if there are any questions. I'll also hand over back to the facilitator right now. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, George. That was a great one. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation. It was very insightful. However, if there are questions, please let's continue to put our questions in the chat so that he can do justice to the question. If he can transfer the host right back to me, that would be great. Thank you. So moving on, we'll be bringing back on board, or we'll be bringing on board rather, a seasoned pen tester and someone that has a vast wealth of experience in pen penetration testing and detecting weaknesses in web application. And like presently she is serving with as an application security engineer at Klas Inc, and she'll be speaking to us about API security best practices. So Abigail, do we have you in the house? Abigail, are you there? Abigail.
The moderator has already given has already given description of what I do and the company I work with. So I'm just going to go ahead to talk about what I have to here. So today I'm going to be talking about API security best practices. Yeah. So, and the overview, I'm going to cover the importance of API security, although the first speaker, George, had already covered most of those things. So I'm going to cover some. Yeah, importance of API security. I'm going to cover different API security risks, and then I'll cover the API security best practices. So, yeah. Why is API security important? So API security, it's important to prioritize API security best practices because this helps safeguard data, maintain companies' trust, and also help companies to comply with laws and regulations. I'm going to talk about the different laws and regulations soon. Yeah, so it also helps companies to mitigate risks that are associated with cyber attacks. Yeah, so we have different attacks there, which Stanley mentioned. Yeah, he mentioned cross-site scripting, he mentioned cross-site scripting and other attacks. Yeah, so it helps, API security helps to prevent our data, helps to maintain companies' trust. Yeah, so why is API security important? One of the reasons API security is important is to ensure the protection of data and information that is stored on an API. So that is stored on an API. Yeah. API security, if an API is secured, it's going to help to protect data exposure. An example of a recent API data breach is one that Duolingo faced. Yeah, so it happened few weeks ago or some days ago? Yeah, about 2.6 million users. Yeah, about 2.6 million users' data were taken. Yeah, and this data included their email addresses, usernames, languages, and the languages they are learning. So about 2.6 million users of Duolingo was breached. Yeah, and this wasn't just breached, it was sold in a hacking forum. So if an API is secured, if their API was secured, the attacker wouldn't have had access to that API to steal about 2 point something million users' data. And 2 point something million is a lot if you should think of it here. So API often handles sensitive data such as user information, financial transactions, or medical records. So ensuring API security helps to protect this data from unauthorized access. They help to protect against data leaks. Yeah, because the example I gave, the application was leaking about 2.6 million. If this API wasn't leaking this number of user details, yeah, they wouldn't have taken them. So API security helps to prevent unauthorized access from different cyber attacks. It helps to prevent data leaks, and also it helps to prevent breaches. Another reason is that it helps to protect business reputation. So a business reputation can be severely damaged because of a security breach. Just like the example I gave, yeah, customers and partners might now have trust issues here with companies if that company faces a certain cyber attack. Yeah, they might start thinking if their data is secured. For example, a company faced a cyber attack and the email addresses of its users were exposed and sold on a hacking forum. So these customers will be wondering, thinking, and they have to be on a lookout for phishing emails, because once your email addresses are sold out to hackers, the next thing that they're going to start using your email addresses for malicious activities, sending you malicious links, malwares, and all that, so they can gain access to your computer and other information about like your financial information. Yeah, so API security helps to protect business reputation. Another thing API security does is that it allows organizations to meet compliance requirements. So when I was giving the overview of API security, I mentioned it helps us to comply with different regulations. So one of the most popular compliance regulation out there is the General Data Protection Regulation. So this is a data protection regulation that significantly impacts how organizations handle personal data, not only in the European Union, but when dealing with European Union residents' data. So the GDPR is the most popular compliance regulation out there. We have other regulations. So if you're an organization and you're dealing with clients' data, you have to search for different compliance regulations that apply to your company, because this will save you a lot. Because if a compliance regulation should find out that you're not following, if they should find out you're not following the particular regulation that was set out, yeah, you have to pay a huge fine. Here, you have to pay a huge fine. So API security helps organizations to meet these compliance requirements. Yeah. Another thing is that API security is essential because it helps to prevent financial loss. It helps to prevent financial loss from cyber attacks. Imagine your API wasn't secure, then you faced a ransomware attack. Yeah, or your company faces any type of attack. Yeah, this would damage your business reputation and also cause you to spend a lot of money trying to go back to how your company was before the cyber attack. Okay, and finally, it also helps to reduce organizations' attack surface. So implementing security measures reduce the attack surface and makes it harder for attackers to exploit vulnerabilities. Assuming your company is performing API penetration testing regularly, often they are taking API security to be very serious. Yeah, just like they're making money and growth marketing. So they're also your company is taking API security important. So this is going to help your company to identify attacks and mitigate those attacks before cyber attackers do. So it helps organizations to reduce their attack surfaces. Okay, moving on, I'm going to talk about, before talking about the best practices for APIs, I'm going to talk about some common API security risks. So we have top 10 API security risks, but I won't cover the top 10. I'm just going to cover a few of them. So we have broken object level authorization. Stanley, speaker, spoke about authentication weaknesses and also authorization weaknesses. Yep, so I won't really go in depth into that. Yeah, so we also have broken authentication in APIs. We have broken property object level authorization. I will talk about them here. So we also have broken function level authorization, and then we have improper inventory management and more. So what is broken object level authorization? Okay, this is a vulnerability in an API's authorization system that allows unauthorized users to access resources they shouldn't have access to. Yeah. So imagine you have a shopping site, your organization is a shopping site, yeah, and you have your organization is a shopping site, I mean, so, and we have sellers and then you have buyers. Imagine user A or buyer A is able to access the resources or see the product that we purchased by user B. Yeah, so that is broken object level authorization. Broken object level authorization is allowing users to access resources they shouldn't have access to. So user A should only have access to his or her resources, and user B should only have access to theirs too. So they shouldn't be able to see other users' resource on the platform. Yeah. if they're able to access those resources, then that's your API is vulnerable to BOLA for short. Yeah. So this is an example. This is just an example I gave out here. So we have, for example, let's say we have an API endpoint here, which is URL/API/products here, and then you have the user ID. Let's say user A ID is 100. Yeah, your unique ID. All users on a particular platform have a unique ID. So for user A, your unique ID is 100, and then there's a product which is, and there's a product on the platform, and that product ID is 345. Yeah, so to request or to be able to view that product ID, this is what the URL is going to look like. So you have your target, you have the target URL, you have the API, you have the product ID, and then you have your user ID. So let's say you want to purchase this particular product, or this is a product you purchased here. Let's say this is a product you purchased. You can change the product ID of this particular product, let's say to 200 or to 300, and let's say product 300 belongs to another user. It is a product that was purchased by another user, and if you change the product ID to 200, and you're able to access that product that was purchased by another user, then you have broken object level authorization there. Another API security risk is the broken authentication. So broken authentication vulnerabilities arise when unauthorized users are allowed to gain access to an API. They're allowed to get access to an API. This is because the API doesn't properly verify the user identity or has poor authentication methods that can be easily compromised. Let's say one of the main ways that we do test for broken authentication is using Bob Suite. So Bob Suite is a tool that allows you to test for different web application vulnerabilities, mobile application vulnerabilities, and also API vulnerabilities. So using Bob Suite, you can test if an API is vulnerable to if an API has a broken authentication. Yeah. So let's say an API uses the JSON web token. Yeah, let's say it uses that, and the web token is a weak one. So this token can be changed. Yeah, this token can be changed to a token of a different user to access an API. So I've conducted penetration testing where this is possible. Yeah, so you have a JWT, and you can switch that JWT to access different accounts. You can switch that JWT, you can manipulate the JWT, or you can also create your own. So broken authentication, conducting API security penetration testing will help us to identify weaknesses like broken authentication. Also, we have the brute forcing. You have brute forcing attacks. If your application doesn't protect against, if your API doesn't protect against brute forcing attacks, so an attacker can perform brute forcing to get the usernames, to get the usernames and passwords of users on your application. We also have other types of authentication attacks like credential stuffing and credential stuffing and other attacks. So broken authentication is just when users are able to gain access to an API. Yeah, unauthorized users, I mean, yeah, they can either get an authenticated user password by stealing that password, or the API itself doesn't have a proper authentication mechanism that has been put in place to protect against unauthorized access. So we have another API security risk, which is improper inventory management. So this one is within an organization. So improper inventory management happens when people have different versions of APIs. Yeah, let me show you an example. So let's say you have different versions of APIs. When companies build APIs, they do have different versions of that API. Yeah, V1 is like version 1 of your API. V2 is version 2 of that API, the updated version of V1, and then V3 is the updated version of V2. So let's go back. Improper inventory management happens when people have different versions of APIs, but they forget to take care of the older versions. Yeah, so let's say you have V3, you had V1, you updated to V2, and then you updated to V3. Now you've forgotten that V1 existed, you've forgotten that V2 existed, you've forgotten that V1 and V2 exist. Yeah, so you're just using V3 and you've forgotten about the other versions of your APIs. But your V3 is updated, and you've performed API security penetration test and you've updated your V3. But now, since you're no longer using V1 and V2, you just leave it there. And let's say V1 has a particular vulnerability like broken authentication. Yeah. So what an attacker can do here is that an attacker can, when conducting penetration tests, we try to test for improper inventory management. So we try to check if an API has an older version that we can access. Yeah. So what we do is that we can change the API version from let's say version 2 to version 1 and try to see if it's possible to access that. If it's possible, if it's possible to access the older version of that API, what we do is that we check if that API is vulnerable to any type of attack. Let's say that API is vulnerable to Bola. The older version is vulnerable to Bola, but the updated version isn't. So once we've successfully had access to the older version, we can perform a broken object level authorization there and do whatsoever we want with it. Meanwhile, version 2 is updated, but version 1 isn't. So people have different versions of API, but they forget to take care of the older versions. So these older versions might have problem or security vulnerabilities that could be dangerous if they are not fixed or removed. So improper inventory management can introduce significant security vulnerabilities into an organization system. Like I mentioned, the example I gave with broken object level authorization. And these vulnerabilities can arise when older versions of APIs are not properly replaced or removed, leading to potential security risks like exploiting like Bola or remote code execution. So you have V1, but you've forgotten that, or let's say you have an API, you've forgotten that API exists, or someone in your organization created an API for a particular purpose. Let's say the person wanted using the API for something, so the person created it. Let's say that person was an intern. That person created the API, used it for the purpose, and then after the person's internship, the person left the company, and every other person in that team have forgotten. They know the API exists, but they've forgotten about it. So they won't update this API. They'll just leave it there. And this is where an attacker can come in to exploit that API version. So, and we also have broken function level authorization. So broken function level authorization is not very different from broken object level authorization. The only difference is that for Bola, you can only access resource that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to another user. Let's say user A accesses a resource that belongs to user B, can see the transactions that user B has made. But for broken function level authorization, you can access and also perform actions. Let's say you've success user A access user B's information. Now, what can user B do? What can user A do? I mean, so this is where broken function level authorization comes in. And if user A is able to delete a transaction that was made, or delete a transaction that was made, or anything in user B's account, this is when an API is vulnerable to broken function level authorization. So this vulnerability allows an unauthorized user to perform actions that they should not have access to. That means these actions can only be performed by administrator or by an admin or people with higher privileges. But a mere user is performing that action, like deleting like deleting a particular user or updating a particular product of another person's account. So broken function level authorization can occur when the API does not properly check the permissions of the user before allowing them to perform a particular action. Okay, this is an example I have here. So let's say you have a particular endpoint, which is API shops, and then which is an API that allows you to shop for products. Yeah, which is an API that allows you to shop for different products here on the platform. So we have the authorization, which is a bearer token, usability token there, and then this is like an endpoint here. Developers and other security professionals that are on this platform might understand this, but let me explain here for those who don't. So this is an endpoint here, and this is like what users are not seeing. Like this is what a normal user isn't seeing, but someone who is conducting a penetration test on a platform, this is what the person sees when the person is using any API penetration to like either Postman or Bobsuit or even your Chrome dev to view different endpoint and the function, different endpoint and the buttons you're clicking on. So let's say you want to purchase a product. This is what it's going to look like. It's going to have the product name, which is product 1, the price of that product, the quantity of the product, and then your shipping address and all of that. Yeah, so let's say this is user B's account, and user B wants to purchase product 1 for the price of $19 here. So what you can do for broken function level authorization, what you can do is to modify this request to a delete request. So let's say user A has accessed user B's account. What user A can try to do is see if he or she can delete that product that was purchased by user B. Or you can try to update the price. So you can either, if user A successfully deletes or updates the price. So this is like a delete. This is like a delete request, and this is an update request. So let's say user A successfully deletes the request that was purchased by deletes this product, that was purchased by user B, or he or she updates the price, then we have broken function level authorization there. So that is it for the vulnerability security risks I've explained. We have other security risks, but because of time, I won't explain all of them. We have the broken object level authorization. This one is a combination of excessive data exposure. Let's say an API is exposing a lot of information, is exposing more information that it's supposed to expose. Let's say an API is just supposed to give out the name and the, let's say, location of a particular of the users on its platform, but it's going beyond that to give out the names, the location, the email addresses, the phone number, the card details. Right there you have a broken object property level authorization or excessive data exposure. And under this broken object property level authorization, we have another type of explanation, which is mass assignments here. So yeah, you're not only trying to, for mass assignments, you're trying to perform actions that you shouldn't. It's not very different from the broken function authorization vulnerability. For mass assignments, you're adding things you shouldn't. Let's use YouTube, for example. You want to like see the number of people that have viewed your video. You posted a video, I want to see the number of people that have viewed your video. I didn't really give an example for that, so I'm just going to try to explain it well. So if you want to see the number of people that have watched your video, yeah, another thing you can do is for mass assignment, you can also try to see, you can add a particular input. Yeah, it would have been better if I had an example here. So you have like a particular you add like a particular input, that allows you to also see, to not only see the number of people that have watched your video, but to see the number of people that have blocked you. So that's like for mass assignments, they are performing actions that they shouldn't be able to, adding more inputs to that request. Yeah, so it's something like that. You also have unrestricted resource consumption, you have unrestricted access to sensitive business flow, you have server-side request forgery, and then you have security misconfigurations. Yeah, so for API-based security practices, yeah, so we have, yeah, the first speaker also gave out some best security practice, so I won't really dwell much on it. Yeah, again, for the ones we explained. So we have you mentioned authentication and authorization. So for authentication and authorization, authentication is just verified, ensure that your API is verifying, the users that are trying to access your API. So this is going to ensure that people that are trying to access your API are authenticated users, they are legitimate users. Yeah. For authorization is to determine what action or data can be accessed. Yeah. Who is trying to access a particular resource? For authorization, yeah. Who is trying to access a particular resource? Yeah, is that person authorized to access this particular resource? Yeah, so that's what authorization does. And also implementing access control is not very different from authorization. So you have to implement access control mechanisms to specify who is allowed to do what within your API. This is going to prevent unauthorized users or systems from performing actions that they shouldn't be able to. Another one, yeah, he also spoke about data encryption. So encrypting requests and responses. Make sure the API you're using you're using is a secured HTTP, is running on the secured HTTP protocol. The HTTP protocol, yeah. So make sure that data is secured and your customers' data are also secure. This is going to help prevent against eavesdropping on your API and also tampering. Yeah. So it's going to ensure that all the actions that have been performed with that API are secured and they can't be eavesdropped, they can't be viewed by attackers when they come to look at your API. Yeah. So we have validating the data. So for validating data helps to prevent actions like mass assignments. Yeah, so it helps, and also cross-site scripting, yeah, and injection attacks. So it's validating data is to ensure that the data that a user is ensured to validating data helps to ensure that the data that your users are putting in are the right data. They are not putting any code or any malware or any script into your application. This is going to help to prevent against SQL, cross-site scripting, and also compromising your API. Yeah, so you have the next one is access your API risk. So what do I mean by access your API risk? This is to like regularly assess the security risks, which I just mentioned. Yeah. So regularly assess the security risks associated with your API. Conduct penetration testing. Try to discover what your API is vulnerable to. Is it vulnerable to mass assignments? Is it exposing too much data about your users? Does it allow users to perform functions they shouldn't, or is it allowing users to access resources they shouldn't? So assessing API security is going to help you to understand the threat landscape and also to help you take proactive measures to mitigate risks. Another one is share only necessary information. Yeah, so minimize the data shared with clients to the minimum required for an API request. So ensure that your API isn't sharing too much about users or isn't sharing too much about your organization. So this is going to help to prevent against information disclosure vulnerability. Yeah. Also, we have choose your web service API. So is it GraphQL you're using? Is it RESTful API? Is it SOAP API? So choose the appropriate API type that works best for you and that works best for your company. Also, when you're looking at them, try to look at the security aspects too. When you're trying to choose a type of API, try to look at the security aspect too. Is GraphQL good for you? Is RESTful good for you? So one of the things I've noticed about RESTful APIs is that they tend to expose too much information about their clients compared to GraphQL APIs. Yeah. So moving on, we have record APIs in an API registry. So recording your API will help you to prevent a security risk like improper asset management or improper inventory management. If you're recording your APIs, you have a list of the outdated, you have a list of older APIs, and you have the list of the updated APIs, and this will help you know which API is updated and which API has to be updated, or which API has to be disconnected from the production phase. Yeah. Also, conduct regular security penetration tests. Ensure that you're conducting security tests on your APIs, like you have API Sentry here, which is just going to be launched. Yeah, you can use tools like that to conduct API penetration tests. You also hire penetration testers, because it's not everything a tool can detect for you. Like a vulnerability like broken object level authorization, it's not, and a tool cannot detect that for you. Yeah, you have to use, this is where a penetration tester comes in to work with the tool, to work with these tools to discover these vulnerabilities for you. Another thing we have is add AI to API monitoring, and threat detection. Make sure you're using AI, is not API. So make sure you're using AIs to monitor to monitor your API and to also detect threats. Yeah, as API is advancing, it's good to leverage. As AI, So as AI is advancing, it's good to leverage AI for API monitoring and threat detection. And finally, we have understand the full scope of secure API consumption. Yeah, so consider the entire life cycle of API usage, from design and development to deployment and retirement. So API security measures at each stage to ensure that APIs remain secure throughout their life cycle. So just try to take note of the usage of your API from the development and down to the retirement phase. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah. And if you want to connect with me, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Gateway and security. And it is my delight to welcome on board Khadijat Sulaiman. Khadijat, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
It's all right. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
I'll be transferring the host right to you so that you can share your screen. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Please let me know when you can see my screen.
Yes, your screen is up.
Hello, afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Khadijat Sulaiman, as introduced, and thank you, Abigail and George, for doing justice to the previous topics, because to understand API gateway and security, we need to have a sound understanding of what APIs are and what the API security is. So let's dive in. So what we'll be discussing, status quo, API threats and vulnerabilities, what is an API gateway, benefits, API gateway architecture, common functionalities of API gateway security checklist, the popular API gateway tools and the API gateway mechanisms. So API security challenges are our status quo. API security challenges are a natural successor to the earlier waves of security concerns in the web. Well, I don't want to dive much in. I don't want to indulge much into what API security is. I think you've heard so much. Your ears are so full what API security is. I think you all have to be experts in API security, so I'll just rush through to go to the main topic of the day. So API security challenges are a natural successor to the earlier waves of API security concerns on the web. Security should be an essential element of any organization's API strategy because APIs provide a much more flexible conduit into the back end, allowing an API consumer much more granularity and flexibility in terms of what information and how much information it can fetch from the back end. All this long English is just talking about how vulnerable, how important the security of APIs are because they are the point of access to the back end database. Then depending on how an API has been written, it will dangerously expose back-end data, back-end architecture, and back-end applications to hacks and provide easy, low-lying clues to attach attack vendors. When an API has been written or has been structured poorly, security-wise, it could expose a lot of means, whereby because it is the point of access to the back-end data, it could expose a lot of risk to security. API could easily allow bulk data transfers much more easily than is possible with web applications. An API could be called repeatedly to compromise data or generate a DOS attack. We've all heard about what DOS attacks is. Risks posed by APIs include loss of integrity, confidentiality, and availability of data in some cases. The business impact of the security incident resulting from an attack on an API might be so extreme. We've seen and we've had issues especially on Twitter, whereby a lot of sites are taken over by malicious hackers, displaying a lot of unwanted content that deviates from the essence of that website. Because API is the point of access to the backend, it is one of the most easiest access to vulnerability and attacks. So what are API threats and vulnerabilities? George and Abigail has already talked a lot about this. We are already aware of what DOS attacks are: XSS, XML injections, malicious code injections, parameter attack, lack of rate limiting, and all. So now, what is API gateway? An API gateway is a server that acts as a single entry point for managing, aggregating, and routing client requests with appropriate microservices. It serves as a mediator between clients and microservices. API gateway provides a standardized interaction process to make API communications more manageable and secure. Because of the importance of API security, we've all heard about all day long and how much vulnerable it is, then we have to find a way to mitigate these security challenges. This is where API gateway is. In simple terms, API gateway is just like a middleman between the client side and the business logic side, or the back end, or the database we have. Imagine you have a house which is not fenced, and then anyone can just come into the house and get out at will. Because of the outside of the house is where the client side is, and then the inside of the house is where the database is. Then you come, and instead of just allowing access from the front, from the back, from the side, and you decide to fence in your house and put in a gate and a door. That door serves as the API gateway, just like the name sounds. I'm just using this analogy to help you relate and understand more. The gateway serves as the point of entry. Instead of allowing everyone to come into that house from both north, west, south, and east, you just put in a gate and allow the gates to be the point of entry to the API, point of entry of the API. So a key function of API gateway is to improve the security of APIs and the data they provide. It offers security, governance, integration, and acceleration of APIs. API gateways serve as a means to decouple the client interface from the back-end implementation. When a client makes a request, the API gateway breaks it into multiple requests, routes them to the right places, produce a response, and keep track of everything. So from this statement, we can see that the overall challenges we've been hearing today about what API, the importance of API security, the risk associated with APIs security and all. This statement try to compare the solution this API gateway provides to those risks. Let's check through the benefits of API security. Now, elimination of round trips. Initially, when we have an API gateway, let's say you have a web application, which is a retail store, you can view a service, order a service, and request for delete a service or something of such. So initially, in just normal terms, a simple terms application where you just have the front end and then the back end and just an API without a gateway. We have round trips. When you send in a request, oh, let me see this. When you click on a service or a product, sorry, when you click on that product and you say, let me see this product, you view it, you swipe next, you bring up the price, you try to go to checkout. All those clicks you make are going round trips of the API are making to the back end. So to eliminate and those round trips, like this back and forth that the API does, it overwhelms the API, and it's not advisable security-wise to have a lot of round trips between the API and the clients, the back. And that is why some of the, we see applications have the database shutting down. Okay, yeah, we say the servers are down and all. So some of the benefits of API is elimination of this round trips request, improved authentication and authorization. Abigail and George has already made you aware of what authentication and authorizations are. So API gateways provide an efficient reinforcement of authentication and authorization policies to ensure that no unauthorized users gain access to the API and the underlying mechanisms. Protection of sensitive data. By acting as an intermediary, an API gateway protects sensitive data transmission via API from unauthorized access. Because when you have authentication and authorization, when you restrict access to who comes into your house, nothing will leave the house without you knowing of, I'm just using the analogy of having a house and a gate. Provide defense against attacks. The most common attacks, Abigail and George has talked about the SQL injections, the XSS, the CSRF, and all. API gateways provide defense against these attacks. Enhanced microservice security. API gateways provide an added layer of security to microservices by making it difficult to attackers to reach and compromise them. This is because the API gateway shows the underlying infrastructure of the microservices in the back end. Traffic overload. We've heard about DOS attacks where the API can be called multiple times by overwhelming it and then causing it to break, to come to a halt, and how that causes a security breach. So by providing traffic overload protection, API gateway mitigates that. Circuit breakers adds to the security posture by ensuring that connection to the backend service is secured. It works by stopping connections to the backend for a defined period of time if it detects a number of consecutive connection failures is reached. So when you have a normal API, you can keep calling, for instance, attackers can hack through the API easily by posing different API calls, sending in different requests, which can cause circuit break and easily lead to DOS attacks. Then decoupling of the back-end microservices and from the front-end application. This is one of the major importance of the API. Before, your house everyone has access to your house. Everyone can come in and get out at will. But with the implementation of API gateway, you have restriction, like you've decoupled, you've restricted who will get into the house and who will get out of your API. So this is a simple API gateway architecture by British on LinkedIn. And he provided the vision of the API into 5 major layers. The network security layers, where we have the farewell rules, the administrative layers, which offer administrative activities, the other administrative layers, because of API, the backend poses business logic. So we have a lot of administrative activities over on the API gateway. Then the access layer, then the transformation layer. So what are the common functionality of this API gateways? So we have the functionalities listed, and then we have them presented on the diagram on the right, sorry. So this is just like a request coming, a HTTP request coming from a client, which can be web, mobile, or PC. And when to show just how the API gateways function, this request comes, when it goes through parameter validation. This is the API gateway, this gate that we have, this square we have surrounding, and this is what the functionalities it gives. So when this HTTP request comes, the first thing it does, the API gateway does, it validates the parameter. Okay, does this contain anything that is not required by, does this contain valid parameters specified here? Does the request contains valid parameters? If it passes this validation, then it moves to the whitelist or blacklist, which is also known as allow deny list. Does the request contains does the request passes this list? Does it contain anything that is part of a denied list? Okay, for instance, if a request does not contain a bearer token, for instance, or if a request does not contain authorization, a kind of authorization, there are certain validations that are put into the allow and deny list. So it's the API gateway. The API gateways confirms and validates the request, and then send it into authorization and authentication. It authorizes that the user is authorized to go through, and then authenticates that the request is authentic and it's not coming from a malware. Then rate limiting. Has this request been going back and forth, coming in over time? Like maybe has this request come in before? Has this request, what's the time of the point of entry? How much time did it take to come here? So it validates the rate limiting, dynamic routing, the service discovery, and then protocol conversions. In addition to these validations that the API gateway carries out, it also carries out error handling. If there is any error encountered while going through this process, it's the API gateway take note of that and shoot out an error. The circuit break, it also confirms and validates if there is any circuit break due to continuous API calls or overwhelming of the API. It sends in like this. Those that are in red are things that are functionalities that are pertaining to security threats. And these are some of just the instances of tools that are used to show these activities. So API security checklists. What are the major API security checklists? What are the important things that an API gateway should contain? And what are the actions that this API gateways, should perform? So it's, first of all, we have HTTPS and encryption of requests. To improve the security of an API gateway, we should first ensure that its communication with clients is by HTTPS. We know how important having requests that comes over like now, I don't think there's any application, web application, or any service that is deployed which does not have a secure HTTP. Sensitive data, both at rest and in transit, should be encrypted to prevent eavesdropping or tampering by unauthorized parties. Moreover, API should use protocols such as SSL/TLS. The use of TLS protocol is especially important when transmitting sensitive data by execution, such as logging into an email service, a bank account, or a company system remotely. This is how important because of how important the sensitive information contained in these services. Your email service alerts contains a lot of information, passwords, and personal information. So your bank statement, let's not go there. We know how important this is. So all the services should be secure enough to have SSL, TSL, HTTPS, and all. So the API gateway, when you use an API gateway, the API gateway encompasses all the security protocols required. Parameter validation. An API gateway passes and validates the attributes present in the HTTP request. It examines the various components of the request, such as the headers, the parameters, and the body, to ensure that they meet requirements, the required criteria, and conform the expected format. This process helps maintain data integrity and ensures that only valid and properly formatted requests pass further into the system. Because a lot of security threats are sent in via the malicious codes are sent in via different components of the request, such as headers, parameters, and then the body. Parameter validation. That when I was talking about the functionalities in the previous document, you saw I said parameter validation is one of the first actions performed by the API gateway. It validates the overall parameters that comes along with a request to ensure that there is no malicious action contained in either the header, the body, or the parameters. Rate limiting. API rate limiting helps prevent excessive API requests from overwhelming upstream services, a technique often utilized during distributed denial of service attacks. Once you limit rate requests, the API gateway can only accept a specific number of simultaneous client requests during a given time. By implementing rate limiting in the API gateway, organizations can protect their back-end services from excessive traffic or abuse, ensure fair usage of API resources, maintain system user stability, and provide a consistent, reliable experience to all clients. This is self-explanatory. In simple terms, once the API gateway poses rate limiting to ensure that APIs are not overwhelmed with calls. Without rate limiting or without an API gateway, an API can be called like uncounted number of times. You can just keep calling an API. That is what causes the backend to come to a halt or to break. So with rate limiting, it prevents that, and then thereby preventing the DOS, which is one of the most commonest security hack threats in APIs. Then monitoring and logging. It's crucial to log the activities of API to track client requests. With the API gateway, it monitors and track every activity that the API of the API, all calls, no matter all the number of calls that are executed on an API. The API gateway monitors and logs them. This provides vulnerable insight in case someone tries to exploit any vulnerabilities around the API gateway. It provides visibility into potential threats or problems. Services. Services currently faced. An API gateway centralized metrics and logs aggregation, capturing information about traffic and requests. Enable web application firewall. Protecting the API gateway with a web application firewall is effective to secure the API and its gateway. A WAF restricts access to APIs based on sets of predefined conditions and rules, securing the API from common threats and vulnerabilities. It helps secure the API gateway from common threats, such as cross-site scripting accesses and injection attacks. All the security measures, like as you can see, the API gateways does not just employ the usage of a single security measure. It uses multiple to provide the extreme, to provide as much security towards your API as possible. Implement API-led connectivity. The API separate gateways. Separate API gateways should be created for each use case when an application utilizes various connections, such as IoT devices, mobile apps, etc. The separation can help prevent exposing endpoints intended for an internal use to external use. So, what are the most popular API gateway tools we have? To mention a few, we have API Gateway, we have Kong, we have RPG Edge, we have Azure API Management and TYK. But Amazon API Gateway is one of the most commonest, and this will be our use case in this study. So these are the API Gateways mechanisms, security mechanisms. We have 4. We have the AWS IAM, we have the Cognito. We'll see them one after the other. So the first API gateway security mechanism we'll be discussing is securing an API with IAM. AWS IAM has the ability to give granular access to different users by creating different policies and keys for each user. This is a simple diagrammatic representation of what AWS IAM is. AWS IAM leverage the use of, let's say, access keys to access the API. How does this work? The user would have created an account and he has an account with AWS Identity Access Management, which is the IAM. And this IAM would, before a user can access the Amazon API gateway, this IAM would have provided a token and a security key and security access key, which are the IAM credentials. The user now imputes to get access to the API gateway. The user imputes this IAM credentials through the Amazon API gateway. Then the Amazon API gateway will now verify with the IAM. Are these credentials valid? If they are valid, then it now gives access to the AWS Lambda, which is the backend services, or let's say, which is backend service. In this case, this is just an instance. So in simple terms, it's just like AWS IAM is one of the simplest API gateway security mechanisms, and it is like here, like it is stated here, IAM is not used standalone, but with other methods, because if the access key gets compromised, the API also gets compromised. Once a malicious user or a hacker or whoever is trying to get access to your API, gets access mistakenly to your API access keys, your AWS IAM is compromised. He can access your Amazon API gateway and then your backend information. So it's a simple term. It's a simple security measure. It is important because the granularity that is stated here means that you can grant access to different users. For instance, you have different users, and let's say you have let me use an instance where you have a website that sells a commercial website, and then you want to grant admin access to, you have an admin account which has admin access, and then you have just normal users account. You can use AWS IAM to grant granularity, meaning that you can grant access to the admin to be the only one to access the delete function. Let's say to delete a product. Like you're giving only the admin the ability to delete a product. That's the granularity. While other users can only like view products, edit products, okay, add to cart, remove from carts and all. But deleting a product can only be done by an admin. Yeah. So the second mechanism we'll be discussing is the Cognito user pools. Cognito is AWS identity management service where you can create user pools and manage those user pools. It lets you create optimizable authentication and authorization. You can use these pools to control who can invoke your API. So now we've talked about the authorization and authentication. Excuse me. We've talked about authorization and authentication over and over again. So Cognito user pools is a means to provide that authorization and authentication of users. So how do we use AWS Cognito? So this is a diagram, like this is just a visual representation of what happens. If you go to the Amazon Web Service site, you'll see you can get access to these services and you can get access to these services and you'll see it in practical, but this is just a visual representation. It's not like how we have it on these images. That's how it is on the actual site. So here, to use Cognito user pool, let me just use layman English. Just like, we have secure password, what do you call it? Excuse me. Services that help you secure your password. I know there is one like Save, Remember Me, or something like that. It's Cognito user pool. It's just an identity management. It's just an AWS. It's an AWS service where it just helps you save your like username and password. That is just in simple terms what it does. So to use the Cognito user pool, a user will go and create an account with a pool ID. Like you create an account with the Cognito, then the Cognito will provide you with a client ID, and the client ID is generated. This client ID, it's like maybe it's like the username, your username. This not really username in literal terms. I'm just trying to use simple terms. This client ID will be the means of the generation of user tokens that the Cognito will generate for you. I'm just trying to make it straightforward, so I'll just go from number 1 to 2 to 4. So when you're creating this account, you can assign the user pool as authorizer for API gateway method. You can assign, okay, after I've created this user pool and this is my user ID, the client ID, you'd like make a specific request that when an API gateway, an API method is coming, okay, if someone is sending in a GET request, the request should have an authorizer on it. On the headers, let's say there should be a bearer token authorization, or let's say there should just be an authorization on the header. Like you have to specify where the authorization would occur while you're creating the user pools, the API gateway method. So now, how does this work? So I've already registered with Cognito. It has my username and password. It has generated my ID. So when I'm trying to sign up into the pool, okay, I'm trying to get access to my API gateway, I'll just sign in using my pool ID and then my client ID. The ID that was generated here, which can be the username, and then the client ID, which can be the generated token that was generated here. When I sign in here, then it confirms, does this credentials comply with the pool ID and then the client ID? if it complies, then it's this because I provided this client ID. The client ID will generate a token. User exchange credentials receives a token ID. It can be a JWT token form. So when this bearer token, when we receive this, JWT token or whatever type of token that is generated from this cognito, then we can now use it to call our API gateway. This is our API gateway. When we send this token that was generated to our API gateway, the API gateway will now will insert that token, apologies. After this token is generated, you remember here we said, okay, if we have to receive a GET request, that GET request has to have an authorization of a bearer token on the headers. We use that this token that was generated, incorporate it into the headers of a GET request. And then we now send that request, the GET request, to the API gateway. When the API gateway receives that request, it will now come back here to the full ID. Okay, this is a GET request. Okay, remember, every GET request will have a bearer token authorization on the header. It now checks, okay, does this method has a bearer token? Does this method has a bearer token on the header? Yes, it does. Okay, let's check. Does it comply with the token that was generated by the cognito? If it does, then it gets you access to the backend Lambda or to your backend or database or whatever. I hope you get what I'm saying. If it doesn't, the API gateway, if the token that you provided on the header of the API method, of the API get method, does not comply with that present in the API cognito pool, it will reject you and it will prevent the user from getting access to the backend data. So this is in simple terms. I hope you all get the point I'm trying to make here. With just Cognito is the one responsible. You have to create an account with Cognito, which is just a means of storing your username and password. Then the Cognito will provide you with a token. You use that token on your method, on your API methods, when calling API methods, and that token you provided will add additional security advantage because the API gateway will not let you access the backend data unless the token you provided is in compliance with the one generated from the Cognito pool. However, the shortcoming, not really a shortcoming, it's just good to note that the Cognito user pools do not support granular methods based on permissions like you could do with AWS IAM. We remember you can give in AWS IAM in the previous method, in the previous mechanism, security mechanism, in AWS IAM, you could give granular access to, let's say, admin to only be able to delete and to perform a particular action. Let's say delete, like I used in that example. But with AWS Cognito user pools, it's not that you cannot this is one user, you can say, okay, another user, you create another pool. Okay, that user, you create another user pool with ID for post requests. Then you now come and create another one for edit requests. It's not that it's not possible, it is very possible, but it is not, how do I call it? It is not in compliance, it's not important, it's not what is advised, it's not advisable to do that because it's not advisable to keep creating different pools. So to do that, to solve this issue, we have the Cognito identity pool. The Cognito identity pool is a mechanism which is a combination of the AWS IAM and then the Cognito user pool. So the Cognito identity pools leverages both IAM and JSON Web Token, JWT. Cognito Identity Pool also provides granular access because it is leveraging the IAM rule. So in simple terms, let's see what the user Cognito Identity Pool does. The Cognito Identity Pool provides uses a different identity provider. Like in this example here, you see, we can use identity provider can be different from that of the user pool, Cognito user pool. You can use other identity providers like Facebook, Google, Auth0, or whatever identity provider you have that stores your identity. So when a user, the first action is that the user will try to log in. Let's say you want to log in using Facebook, Google, or using your user identity pool. When you log in, the Cognito Identity Pools, it sends identity token, JWT, to the Cognito Identity Pool. After logging in, it's like what the login you did at the first time in the case of Cognito user pool. It logs in, then it sends a JWT to the Cognito Identity Pool. When the Cognito Identity Pool confirms the what do you call it, the token that was generated, then it assigns an IAM rule for authentication for an authenticated user. Okay, it gives you, okay, this person, I see this token is valid. Okay, I'll give this person an IAM rule. Just when it assigns the IAM rule to this user, then it sends back the access credentials, which is the access key. AWS credentials, it contains the access key, your security key, and the session ID. It is sent. This session ID is where we leverage the IAM rule that the AWS IAM provides. In the Cognito user pool, you don't have the session ID, like it's just once. But here, because we are using IAM can provide like different IDs. That is why we have, in addition to access key and the secret key, we have a session ID. So it is sent back to the user, and the user will now try to access the AWS services using the credentials allowed by the IAM rule. Using AWS IAM, then you can access the backend. So in addition to just leveraging the Cognito pool, here we are like combining both the AWS IAM and then the Cognito user pool to gain access. So in this case, when you're using Cognito Identity Pool, you're like having a two-way authentication. First, you're using both IAM and Cognito Identity, and then you can create different IAM rules. You can create different user credentials for different users, and this is a more authentic. This is a more advanced or more authentic means of mechanism of securing the API gateway. Then the last is Lambda authorizers. Lambda authorizers are Lambda functions that control access to API methods using a token authentication or complex authentication and information that comes from the request. Lambda, so in Lambda authorizers, the difference between the Lambda authorizers and then the Cognito Identity Pool is that in Cognito Identity Pool here, you see we use Cognito Identity as the means of verification. But in Lambda, we can use a separate, an external means of identification, external means of identity provider. So in this case, you see, we use Auth0. You can create an Auth0 account. Then after the account is created, the user will sign in into the Auth0. Then after the user signs in into the Auth0, we use a Lambda authorizer for API gateway method. This is where we insert the Lambda. When you insert the Lambda with specification of the Lambda requirements, and this is our API gateway, then the user will now exchange the token, just like here. After you sign in, you already have a created account, and then application is already created. You have your credentials, just like we did in IAM. The user would first of all sign in into auth, then the auth will now the user exchanges credentials and receives an token ID. After sending in your user ID, after signing into auth, and auth will send in your authentication ID and gives you an token ID. With your token ID, you use that token ID to call API method with the token, just like we did in user pools. Let's say you put this BRR token onto the onto post request in this case. When it comes here, instead of gaining instead of in the case of Cognito, where we had the Cognito user pool just verifying the authenticity of the token on the headers, here Lambda will be the one that will assign, that will validate your token and return the to the IAM policy. So that's why I said the main difference between the Lambda authorizers and then the Cognito identity pool is that instead of using like in services Cognito to be the authentic identity verifier, we can use an external identity verifier. So here, Lambda is our Lambda is the one that authenticates and returns the IAM policy. It validates it with auth, and if the token is valid, then the backend Lambda, we have access to the backend Lambda. If the token is not valid, you wouldn't have access to the backend Lambda. So when to use what? When to use what? So we've seen the different security mechanisms. So this is just a summary of when do we use what mechanism. So we use API key because it's the least secure. We use them when we are running just test apps in-house. We use them for internal APIs. And sometimes these API keys are used with sometimes production APIs with key rotation. Sometimes API key, as insecure as they are used in production APIs, but then the keys has to be rotating. They have to be changing like frequently. So it's like, that's why you see sometimes keys, you receive keys token on your phone when trying to log in to your bank app, and it just takes, I'm just giving that as an instance, it takes like 10, 15 seconds, 30 seconds at max, and then the API key is invalid. So when do we use AWS IAM? It is never, like, it is almost never used by itself. Like you don't use IAM just alone. When do we use Cognito pool? We use Cognito pool when using AWS identity provider. That is, like I said, you cannot use Cognito pool when you are using an external identity provider. Cognito pool is for in-house AWS identity, is an in-house AWS identity provider. And Cognito identity pool, when do we use this? We can use it to reuse credentials from specific IDP. That is internet identity providers like Facebook, Google, Amazon, auth, or whatever, and or IAM when granularity is needed. Then when do we use Lambda authorizers? When using external IDP, Okta, add, auth, etc. Whenever you're using any external identity provider, we use Lambda. And that is it. These are my references, and thank you for having me. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much, Khadijat. We do enjoy the session. Actually, the session was very nice. Thank you very much. The presentation was very informative. Thank you so much. So in the next few seconds, we're going to take questions for If you have questions, please do well to drop it in the chat so that we can go through your questions. Do we have any questions? So, okay, it's all right then. Khadijat, please stop sharing, then transfer the host right to me. Thank you so much for joining us again. Thank you for the presentation. It was very wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Stop sharing.
Okay, there's a question for you in the chat. The question says that is it possible to use more than one tool per time, like Lambda and Cognito together?
I haven't